I mean, for me, for sure, I mean, is a light combining between the historical and the symbolical. I mean, he knew all mythology. I mean, he knew all of mythology and all of like, it's vast. I mean, Peterson, when he says like, you read Jung, you kind of get scared a little bit by like the force to be reckoned with, which is like Jung's historical breadth and depth of knowledge, where he just sees like these historical processes that happen, and it's frightening. And Neumann has the same exact thing. I mean, once you read that, that was definitely a big part, which contributed to confusion in a certain sense, but also a period of growth in my individual life. Because I mean, once you read this stuff, I mean, you start thinking in historical processes that are very large. I mean, he opened up a whole entire world for me.
What up, Seekers? This next friend of mine is kind of like Kerouac meets Wordsworth meets Moses, and he's a dynamic poet, a visionary thinker, really. So don't leave if you get scared off by Shimmy in the first 5 minutes. He's definitely worth sticking around for. In the conversation, we dive headfirst into that space between history and myth, and we explore at large length the theories of Erich Neumann. And with no further ado, Shimmy Weinbach.
Shimmy, a few months ago, I think, I sent out a short questionnaire to our little group, and I'm going to read out what you answered in the questionnaire, and you can feel free to correct me because you're not the same person you were a few months ago. I sure hope you're not. So Shimmy Weinbach of the past was passionate about conversation, inner change, psychology, and the biblical world. He was currently studying the development of perceptions of God. He was working on a little video for the Seekers channel called Who Was Erich Neumann? An intro into the Jewish psychoanalytical giant. The idea that was possessing at the time was the thought that our thoughts are far beyond us. And your favorite living thinkers were Erich Neumann and Nir Stern. And you are currently reading The Roots of Jewish Consciousness, Part 2, Hasidism by Erich Neumann. So how do we stand in contrast to then?
In relationship to past Shimmy?
To past Shimmy, how do you feel about him?
We're standing pretty well. I mean, I would definitely say that it's the same subjects are really on my mind. I kind of had a big disillusionment with anything dealing with metaphysics or anything having to do with the archetypal psychology or therapy, according to Jung and his students. I had felt for a long time that, in a very Jewish manner, that someone whose wisdom outdoes his deeds is like a tree whose roots are very small and his branches are long, and any wind that comes can kind of uproot him. So I've been working on a lot of grounding, but really in the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I mean, what to do because of Corona, there's a lot of free time, and I've been delving back into these subjects. And, the more that you kind of work on your individual progress, you start to see really how the archetypal and how the mystical and esoteric really is but a translation. The translation is Perush, is really just another level which is built upon reality itself. So the stronger hold that you have on reality, the more refined and the more clear these kind of metaphysical concepts become, because they actually have a living connection to what's going on in your own life. And so this new delving kind of into Neumann, it's been an interesting trip in the past month. Yeah, I mean, that's where I am right now. Definitely a renewed love for the Bible, trying to understand what the Bible really is, which has been, kind of just with a dip of my toe into the areas of just reading a little bit about yoga. I'm reading a little bit, very, very little about the Upanishads, but really trying, if you look at other holy books, and again, my knowledge with Eastern religion is, I don't know, maybe Eastern religion also has an eschatological viewpoint, but kind of bringing in question and kind of localizing and giving context a little bit, from the kind of Judeo-centric thinking, that I've lived for 27 years, and just even the thought that there's, entire other systems of thought. It makes you question, what is the Bible? why is it being written? What is the significance of it? And, being introduced to biblical criticism, and then trying to understand biblical criticism, not in the light of its, not letting it just be standard reductionist theory, but actually trying to understand what the Bible is from a symbolical and mythological standpoint, and from a psychological standpoint, what it is, and trying to reconcile that with the historical and archaeological. And even I think that the reductionist viewpoint has very interesting, the reductionist and post-structuralist, I think that they have interesting points, and coming to reconcile with them, and trying to bring these schools, together and find the meeting point between history and symbolism. It's definitely something I'm passionate about. And those are just a few of the subjects going through my head right now. Yeah.
Nice. It's interesting to see the transition of sort of your thinking from when we spoke last to when we've spoken now. And there's definitely a lot of very large global and historical events going on, which would give reason for you to think differently about issues. And I want to dive back into that tension between the metaphysical and the present and the historical, sort of that three-way tension there. But let me first, because I know a bit about you, actually I don't know much about you as a person and who you've been and your journey. So if you'd like to, I'd invite you to share your story with myself and with whoever else would be interested.
Sure. Well, I mean, I grew up Orthodox, so I guess what would be called modern Orthodox, in America, which is a very interesting label within itself, because a lot of the modern Orthodox world, generally the educators were Haredi or ultra Orthodox, and therefore, you get a lot of, kind of there's like these modern influences, but also a lot of what you're hearing in the classroom is very ultra Orthodox. Which gives you, which comes along a lot with religious fervor and things that I'm very grateful for. But also comes along with a certain mindset. I mean, I grew up in a rabbi's house, and my father is very, in the last years, has become very into academic and archaeological thinking, and seeing that important context. And I myself, I guess that was always present in the house, this kind of critical thinking. And as you kind of start to mature, you start to see that, okay, like ortho practice, or orthodoxy, and especially, once you start to learn the more historical aspects of things, it brings things under question, and kind of, dealing with that tension where you don't want to nullify your tradition, and you want to stay, you want to stay faithful, because you understand, and especially psychologically and in life, the importance of faith, but also having that come into, serious question, and then having those beliefs continually reform themselves, and finding yet again and again and again, no matter how much you learn, that those basic faiths that you learned about, they have much higher understandings. And so, I made Aliyah like 7 years ago, which means that I ascended to the land of Israel. I'm currently doing a tour guide course, which has also exposed me to a lot of, especially we just finished a Second Temple period. And even though we don't go so deep into like Roman history and things like that, the kind of more Masoretic, traditional viewpoint of Chazal on history, of the sages on history, gets like a second tier, and it's like a kind of juxtaposed according to the kind of more historical view of things, and that continually deepens what is the relationship between historical viewpoint and the mythical, symbolical viewpoint of things. And really, and personally, I think because I have a foot in both of those worlds, I find that they enrich one another, and I don't really have the ability yet to formulate why that is. But the historical events, which are the actual, fact-based occurrences that happen in our own personal life as well, have entirely different, psychological significance for us. And the way that we understand them, the way that memory works as well, is completely different, right? The way that I think about my father, for instance, is not necessarily connected to the facts that you can put together inside of a biography. And even if you were to, that would say nothing about my relationship to my father. And then you have that on the universal, you have that on the national and universal level as well. And so trying to understand, how the historical events shape these kind of symbolical understanding of history, and I think that I feel that there's like been this huge split, and it's unfortunate. I mean, I don't understand the academic world so well. I don't know so many people in it, but it would seem to be that there's been this terrible split, you know, and there always are splits throughout history, between the fact that you either have to be you have to be a rationalist, you know, you have to be a rationalist, and especially if you're in the kind of the post-structural camp, which is very prevalent in Israeli academia. I mean, just the way it seems to me. Post-structuralist, you know, very dry historical, archaeological viewpoint on the Bible, without an understanding of the actual knowledge of the ancients, or, you know, you kind of, or you renounce that and, you know, you kind of believe on a more symbolical level. And I mean, I don't know the academia very well. In Israel, you kind of do have religious figures that are also very academic. But it would seem to be that our generation, you know, we have the ability to kind of combine these two strands of thought. And I think that we have that ability because also we're in this stage, you know, and this is kind of a good makpetza, kind of a good springboard into Neumann, which is that we, you know, it would seem to be, and of course everything here is speculation, and it's important to say that, it would seem to be that, you know, the return of the Jewish people to Israel, you know, and Neumann has a clear few sentences where he talks about, or it would seem to me that he is saying that the Jewish people, are anything that is happening within the Jewish people is the microcosm of what's happening on the universal level of consciousness. As we're kind of like, it kind of goes universal consciousness, national consciousness, individual consciousness, right? Or familial consciousness, individual consciousness. And the return to the land of Israel, which is a return kind of to the physical, you know, is kind of the ability to show that the physical, you know, in a very schematic binary manner, to say that the physical and the spiritual do not contradict one another, right? And which is the classic, I think, which is really what's at the heart of Judaism, that it's a non-dualistic, and obviously that could be argued, but that, you know, in returning to the land of Israel, what's signified by that on like an intellectual level in a certain sense is that we are able to interact with the land of Israel, which is kind of this physical, you know, historical, very fact-based. There is land, right? And that is the first level. And then on top of that, there is, how does that, you know, where does that play a role in the symbolical events of, you know, and being a generation that is much more within reality and much more ground-based, I think. I think that allows us to kind of see that those two strands of symbolical and historical, you know, can be combined. And I think it's much more prevalent. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe you'd like some clarification.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up one thread there. You mentioned Neumann, Erich Neumann, a few times. For the listeners who aren't familiar with Erich Neumann, will you just tell us a little who he is, so we can bring him perhaps to be present in this conversation?
Great, yeah, I would love to. So I first heard about Neumann through Jordan Peterson, who I'm a really big fan of, and I hope that he's doing all right. And he had the biblical series, but he also had the personality lectures. And the first one I watched was this lecture that he gives about Jung through The Lion King, right? And there, I think, is the first time that I heard about that he had mentioned this book over here, which is The Origins and History of Consciousness by Neumann. Which, after you read that, you know, it kind of makes kind of Peterson lectures a little bit more elementary, because then you kind of read the textbook. I've read most of it. Definitely bits and pieces, enough to understand, you know, what the basic theories are. Complicated book. It kind of deals with more the universal consciousness and then how that relates to individual therapy. So the individual therapeutic part has a lot of concepts that are very hard to understand unless you're in the therapeutic world and you're an expert in Jungian psychoanalysis. But the first part, where he talks about the 4 stages, mainly the 4 stages in the hero myth, is understandable to all. And it's very interesting. In the beginning, so just a little bit about Erich Neumann is that he was born in 1900, because he died in 1960, I think, or 1965, from cancer in Tel Aviv, actually, which is really significant because I haven't met a lot of people who really know who Erich Neumann is. And I mean, he was, as we would say in Hebrew, the Talmud Chaver, or like the most prominent student of Jung. I mean, Jung writes in the foreword to this that if he had enough time, he would have written the book himself, which is this redaction with all of really bringing in all the mythological and psychological and historical sources for Jung's hero myth theory, redacted into one book. And what's really interesting, especially for me, is that Neumann was a Jew. I mean, Neumann was not only a Jew; he was a Zionist, and I mean, he saw, and it makes sense because he saw the significance of the Jewish people coming back to the land as being the last transformative stage and the return to the divine feminine, which is represented by the land. And I think that's so profound, and I think like it's really chaval. Like it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, I don't know how many people know about Neumann in Israel. I know that a translation to the Jewish roots of consciousness was just done. The English version is great. And Conrad Lammers, I think, who lives in Berkeley. I think she did most of the footnotes and the editing on that book, and then it was translated by, I can't remember her name, here in Israel. So maybe there's a bit of a following, but I mean, in religious circles, I mean, you say the name and nobody knows who it is, but you have like Jung's most prominent student living in Tel Aviv, and it's mind-boggling for me. I mean, in general, Jung is not very well accepted in the academia, so it kind of makes sense. And even though Neumann was not necessarily religious, I mean, he did not keep Torah and mitzvot necessarily. I mean, he wrote this book, which it just like covers the Jewish consciousness in a fascinating and brilliant, ingenious manner that opens up an incredible amount of, it really clarifies a lot, I felt, when I had read it. And I mean, I relate to him in a certain sense as a tzaddik, right? I mean, for me, for sure, I mean, is a light, and is provided as a light, and kind of combining between the historical and the symbolical. I mean, in the Jewish sense, for sure. I mean, but he knew all mythology. I mean, he knew all of mythology, and all of it's vast. I mean, Peterson, when he says like you read, when you read Jung, you kind of get scared a little bit by the force to be reckoned with, which is like Jung's historical breadth and depth of knowledge, where he just sees like these talichim, right? These historical processes that happen, and it's frightening. And Neumann has the same exact thing. I mean, once you read that, I mean, that was definitely a big part of which contributed to confusion in a certain sense, but also period of growth in my individual life. Because I mean, once you read this stuff, I mean, you're just you start thinking in historical processes that are very large. And I mean, he opened up a whole entire world for me.
Is it possible to give a short summary of Neumann's thesis that he presents?
Sure. I mean, I'll do my best. And again, we're saying that it's okay if we're small, but definitely I would like to preface it by saying that I don't have like a very in-depth knowledge of it, but I'll say what I do know. It would seem to me, and this is kind of, again, from Peterson, it gives a really, I'm trying to remember which lecture it is, which of the biblical lectures it is, where he pretty much says that Freud's mythos mechonen, as we say in Hebrew, or in English, the foundational myth of humanity is the Oedipus complex, right? And the Oedipus complex is where the son, who is kind of repressed by the barbaric, gorilla-like father, wants to kill the father and marry the mother. And that kind of, and which makes sense because that came up all the time inside of Freud's, psychoanalysis of people. When people would talk enough, I mean, he'd get into these family, these family problems. And it's a really genius approximation of the psychological status. And it makes sense that would be the foundational myth of humanity. And Neumann does away with that all the time, and he disparages of Freud often. I mean, obviously, with the knowledge that Freud was kind of, very foundational for the rest of psychoanalysis, but also showing the flaws, the obvious flaws, and the projection, the amount of like unhealthy projection that Freud, had upon his own theory, which is inevitable, but he definitely draws that out. And then, so Jung kind of thought that there was a different foundational myth, which was the hero story, right? And the hero, or in the terms of Judaism, the Tzadik, right? He is the foundation of consciousness, and he continually develops, he or she continually continues the developing universal consciousness, because on an individual level, they kind of are the harbingers of their own development of individual consciousness, and that kind of, as we would say, a mitpashet, right? And that kind of spreads out to the universal consciousness in the center. So, which is very empowering in a certain sense, because it means that the individual is always, and this is off. I mean, we always see Jung say this: the individual is what matters in the world. It is the individual. It's important that we have individuals, and that is the way that we change the world, through the individual consciousness. And then, so we have like the first stage of the individual consciousness, but that's always mimicking, and they're kind of mimicking each other, is that you have the universal consciousness here, and you have the individual consciousness. And the hero story, which the hero goes through and the four main stages that he goes through in his individual consciousness, are mimicking this kind of universal consciousness that's going on. So, one example would be the Great Mother, which is the first stage in universal consciousness. So kind of through studying the primitives, right, which is a kind of, we see them as being a derogatory term, but Jung did not view them derogatorily whatsoever, and neither did Neumann, that they were reading both accounts. I can't remember this guy's name, Levi Bruhl, maybe. There was somebody who wrote about the primitives, a French writer who wrote about the psychology of the primitives. And Jung also went around and had looked, and had studied a lot of shamanic cultures. I mean, he had this whole entire Masaya, this whole entire travel that he did in with the North American tribes, in Native American tribes. And so you kind of have, and they mimic kind of the primitive tribes that we can still study today. They mimic this kind of primordial consciousness, which is kind of, the Great Mother is the Ouroboros, right? It's kind of the snake that eats its tail, right? Which is nature, right? Nature continually swallows and gives birth again, swallows and gives birth again. And there's kind of no getting out of that continual process, right? That you can't escape it. It continues and continues and continues, and it happens. And if we look at societies, actually, I mean, we kind of live within a more patriarchal society, but that's not the way history always was. I mean, there were heavily matriarchal, both cults and the way that many ancient societies were based matriarchally. And so this kind of matriarchy that happens, is this stage, and then the patriarchy starts to form itself from that. And so, and we know that, and how would I say, this is a bit complex, but, if we were to say that that's a universal consciousness, right? That kind of, we went from a matriarchal society into a patriarchal society in the individual's life, right? And the matriarchy is in Jung's, is inhibitory, necessary, but inhibitory to the hero's journey, because it will always pull him back into the cycle of nature. It is the over infantilizing mother, which, Jewish boys know very well about, right? Especially Jewish Ashkenazi boys know very well about. Over infantilizing mother that want to keep the child infant, they can hold on to them, right? And especially, I mean, that was incredibly intensified, by Holocaust trauma. Let's not get into that, but very, very prevalent. I mean, that stage of the Great Mother, and the hero kind of needs to identify with the father all of a sudden. He needs to kind of, or the phallus, right? The ability to break out of this societal matriarchy, right? Which on the universal consciousness is the kind of the dawn of consciousness, but on the individual level happens to all of us. It happens to all of us where we're kind of struggling and we can't leave this kind of hold that reality has upon us, the Great Mother has upon us. Yeah, so kind of, I mean, breaking out of the Great Mother stage, which mimics itself both on the individual level, which is breaking out, on the individual level, the way that this works is that take it to a personal place, most people will struggle with whether it's an addiction to reality. When we say reality and when we say the feminine archetype, we're talking about a hold of material over the spiritual. And that will get a whole turn on its head when there's the return to the feminine. I just am explaining this because it has a little bit of a bad connotation when we say, and it's very Gnostic in a certain sense, that the feminine is evil. And I mean, that plays, and Neumann explains it in absolutely genius why the Gnostics thought that. But it's just it's a necessary stage in development, and it doesn't have it's not detrimental. I mean, I don't mean to denigrate the feminine in any sense. I'll just lay out what he says, which is that the feminine, which is, or the great mother, is identified with an overly materialistic, natural hold upon the individual and his psyche, which you cannot break free from. And we have, I mean, this is the problem with addiction, every case of addiction, right? You cannot resist the pull of material upon you, whether that be sex, drugs, drink, gambling, right? Something else has a hold upon you. And in order to break out of that, a lot of therapeutic systems, 11, 13 steps. I don't know what it is, what it's called. But it's identifying with the higher value, right? Which is the identification with the father or the phallus, right? The phallus is what's able to bring you out, and you're able to come out of the kind of this tail eating, snake, which continues to eat itself, right? Which is this return of nature over and over again, the material kind of swallowing you up over and over again. And that over infantilization is a very problematic thing in the individual psyche and leads to plenty of problems, right? Because then you can't, develop your consciousness in a certain sense. And so on the universal level, you kind of have this patriarchal society all of a sudden sprout out of a matriarchal society, which I discussed with Jake one time. Very interesting and his theories about Terence McKenna and how that was actually affected in a materialist sense by the kind of drought of mushrooms. Very interesting what he has to say about it. But I mean, from the Neumann Jungian standpoint, that is just the kind of, the fact of consciousness is that it starts with a matriarchal, dependence on the mother. And then in order for the individual to become an individual, it needs to have this identification stage with the father. We're still in that stage. And I think that we actually need to leave that stage in a certain sense, right? I mean, because we're hyper conscious, right? We're hyper patriarchal in a certain sense, and there should be a return to the feminine. So that's just a little taste, of how the universal consciousness and the individual consciousness kind of mimic one another. And then, so those stages are the four main stages is the great mother or the terrible mother. And then there is, the fight, and then there's the emergent consciousness. The emergent consciousness has to kind of have a fight with a dragon type figure, which is, just it happens in almost every single mythical story, the fight with the monster, right? I mean, even in Harry Potter today, right? Harry has to kind of go down and fight the basilisk in order for the phoenix, which is kind of this motif of renewal, kind of is what brings him back to life. And then he comes up and he kind of has gone through this, religious or this kind of transformational experience. And if you're able to defeat the dragon, then you get the princess, right? Or you get the treasure, which is the transformation. And that's your ability to reenact and re-interact with the divine feminine in a proper, healthy manner, where you're not swallowed up by it anymore because you're strong enough. And Neumann kind of brings that out through showing that, the myths in all different types of cultures that had no connection whatsoever are all kind of telling, he said, oh, this weird, kind of these ancient Near East and Far East. And then you also have the Gothic myths, and you have the Viking myths and the Norse myths, right? And they're all kind of telling, they have kind of cave di mayon, as we say, right? Kind of similar storylines. And so he saw that as, telling the story is the individual's, it's almost kind of like a type of prophecy, right? Like I have this kind of intuition of what the development of consciousness or the way that my individual history works, and then I tell a story in order to try and give that expansion and expression, right, on a story level, and that would seem to be what he's saying is what myths really are. And so, yeah, again, about like these kind of frightening historical ability to view history is just like, you just have this grasp on almost all of history, and it's very elegant, but it's not elegant in an ignorant manner. I mean, it's elegant and it's very profound because he always takes it down to the individual. I mean, the second half of the book is how does that meet in therapy, right? How do we see in the individual's life and in the stages of his own life, how does he affect the changes by reading the, and why do we even hold on to these mythological stories? Why are they important to us, right? Because they show us the way. They show us the way to affect individual consciousness. And individual consciousness, and in Jung and in Neumann, and certainly in Jung, is the most important development. And realizing that the devil and God are both inside of you, and that it is your choice between them, and your choice is bring it to the Rambam, Maimonides, who said that when a man is coming to repent, or tshuva, to return, he has to view the whole entire world kind of on the scales, and that he and his choices is what will tip the scales of the world. And that's, it's so profound, because it doesn't just leave you hanging in the air with these kind of mythical and mythological notions, but actually shows you where you are in your own life. And you have to know your own story. You have to know at what stage you are in this hero story. And it's really profound. And Neumann, this is really the origins and history of consciousness is really the foundation stone. And then he also wrote the origins of Jewish consciousness, right? The history of Jewish consciousness. And as a Jewish person, I just like anybody who has any interest in Jung, must read that book. You have to read the first part for sure. The second part is Hasidism. The first part is just, it's really incredible. So yeah, that's a very non-comprehensive, but also kind of a stab at trying to just explain a little bit of what Neumann is about.
That was really good. That was really solid. I'm curious how much of this themselves they were conscious, and I'm curious how much this comes up for you when you're reading Neumann and Jung and related thinkers who are working in a very archetypal collective consciousness kind of language. How much of this in their mind and in your mind is a narrativization of history, which is in many ways what myths is. It's taking these points of data which don't have meaning or story until they're strung together and given some sort of narrative arc. So how much is it a sort of subjective creation of these geniuses, human minds, these story finding storytellings? And this is really the next level, because we're looking back at tens and hundreds of thousands of individuals throughout history who have done these little story making projects, and we're taking all of those stories, we're making these sort of meta stories on those stories. That's work like
grand narratives.
These grand narratives. Jung and Campbell and Neumann. How much of it do they see as entirely storytelling, and how much of it do they see, because Jung, very much in the tradition of Freud, wanted to see himself as a scientist, and I don't know how Neumann wanted to self-conceptualize, but how much do they see this as? Do they see this as?
Go ahead.
Do they want to see this as beyond the subjective, as something perhaps out there ontological? Do they not see a distinction between the internal and the external? Do they not see? I'm curious, how is this being conceptualized? Because as I'm sitting back and listening, this sounds brilliant, but it also could just sound like a fairy tale, and I can conceptualize this entirely differently.
Right. So kind of just bring your question to even more mufshat level, to even higher abstract level, we see that we're talking, about just the general discussion of subjectivity versus objectivity, which has really come to the forefront, especially in the postmodern post-structuralist critique, which is important critique, very important critique, because it allows us to, really opens up the mind as long as you're able to keep, as long as you're able to have really boundaries around the critique. And I really find it to be a helpful tool for checking the validity of things. I'll say, first of all, it's interesting because Jung's family didn't let the Red Book, which is kind of this, it's this incredible book that Jung writes over this period of 3 years, where he puts himself into a state of psychosis. Yeah.
Before getting to the Red Book, just touch on the postmodern critique. Sure. What are you referring to?
I'm referring to this kind of Weltanschauung, right? If you want to use big German words. This kind of hashkafa, or this kind of worldview. So your question, I mean, kind of if we were to take it on a more abstract level, it's dealing with, in general, just the post-structuralist critique and the postmodern critique of the value of subjective truth, and if there's objective truth whatsoever. And I think it's actually to a certain extent, it's a very helpful critique in the sense that I mean, after you know the hard, fundamental ideologies of the last century, which led to incredible amounts of destruction and death, which kind of, it puts a question if, any one ideology is correct. And it's correct. Not one ideology is correct. It actually helps us to understand the multicolored tapestry and that the subjective truths can work together. And that's by questioning any one subjective truth. But, not to lose sight within that post-structuralist critique and to think that subjective truth is invaluable. That's just like a kind of a pretext, kind of just the way I generally think about the subjective, objective, and post-structuralist critique. And if we're going to bring it to the Neumann Jungian level, I mean, Jung certainly wants to stay within the scientific community. And it's not kind of like today where we have all these break-offs and we have these kind of discussions between intellectuals such as ourselves, and we're talking on this mystical level. It's very accepted. But I mean, even today in the university, there's a certain way and there's certain topics you can talk about and certain not, and certain things are taboo. And so certainly anything that you was kind of dealing with back then was completely and totally taboo. But I mean, what Neumann really brings up in this book, and he has a whole preface where he talks about, is that this is science. I mean, even you have all the requisites for the scientific method. So even on the most academic scientific ramifications for a cold science, you have here. And why is that? It's because, first of all, we have empirical knowledge. What's the empirical knowledge? It's the stories. So now how do we translate the stories? Fine. Obviously, the post-structuralist critique might say, well, you're just translating these stories based on your subjective. Fine. I can't really do anything about that, especially when it becomes so reductionist that you can't really say anything. But healthy structuralist critique would certainly, put an eye on these grand narratives and say, hold on a second, what's going on over here? That's just your subjective kind of hashlacha, your subjective projection. And so, but what's so fascinating and incredible about the origins and history of consciousness, and the whole entire preface here is saying that it's so scientific because it's so empirical. It's because these myths are being told in so many different places at the same time, and that if we take a look at them, we really do see, in a very scientific manner, I mean, that there's a process here, and the fact that it's also mimicked, and of course, that shapes my individual way of looking at my individual life because somebody told me the story, obviously. But like, I think that even if you were to just do the bare bones check on somebody who weren't to have read any of this and were to not have any narrative, I really do feel that we'd be able to identify the same stages of consciousness that he would go through. And I don't think that it's just, some kind of subjective projection, I mean, and where does subjective and where does the objective one and the other begin? I mean, that's Ein Sof, that's infinite. I mean, you can't really trace that. And that's why the post-structuralist critique can totally have no boundaries whatsoever. But this is science in the fact that it's empirical. I mean, most empirical knowledge, you check atoms, you use microscopes, right? You check biology, you look at living life and things. And because this is symbolical, because that's like kind of a flash word where you say the word symbolical or psychological as it is, so it immediately kind of comes off as being something that's unscientific. But all the ramifications for a scientific process are totally used throughout Neumann's. Neumann uses the scientific process, and so does Jung, and therefore, I mean, the amount of empirical knowledge there is vast, and which makes it such a great argument. Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. It's fascinating that that's how they're self-conceptualizing. It's fascinating to see them try to put forth their arguments in that form. You were mentioning something about the Red Book and Jung's family's attempts to suppress it.
Yeah, from what I read, I mean, they didn't let it out right away because it would totally. I mean, he entered. You get the kind of a little bit of an idea of how incredible of, how great of a visionary and how how much control he had over his psyche, that he could voluntarily induce psychosis every night and kind of, and kind of do, we have bibliodrama today, right, where you kind of act out these scenes. I mean, but he was doing it on such a visionary level, and he was talking with these different archetypes that were existing within his psyche. And then, he had like a kind of, he was riding on a train somewhere, and he kind of saw the hills and he had this psychotic episode where he saw the hills being kind of bathed in blood. And this was kind of almost, a visionary thing of World War II or World War I don't remember. And then he realized that he was going through a dissolution of consciousness, but because he's so, which is madness in a certain sense, right? But madness is only somebody who enters into psychosis and isn't able to pull themselves out of it. But he pulled himself out of it continually and went to work, It's just like, wow, And the red book, which I haven't read all of, I read a little bit, I've read a few, overlooks, overviews of it. The family didn't necessarily want to let out, right? Because it would totally paint him as this kind of psychotic individual. Whereas, us as people who grew up in a kind of more Hasidic, with knowledge of Hasidism and mysticism, we know that means nothing. The Rebbe is the one who's able to, the Tzadik is the one who's able to delve into the depths, and this is the hero. And Neumann's, and Neumann in Hasidism talks about this, how the Tzadik is the hero and how they parallel one another, because the Tzadik is the one who's able to plunge into the depths, which is, the unknown, the chaos. He's able to plunge into those into that symbolic realm and bring out the new ethic, right? And that's a bringing of, and that's the hero story. And that's the hero story. And then that, that catalyzes a universal consciousness, right? Right? Well, what is the Baal Shem Tov goes up to Shemayim, right? And what happens there?
He goes to
the Baal Shem says, when will the Geula come, right? Shiafutzu ma'anotecha, right? When your fountains overflow. And that's a great paradigm, and that's a really great mashal, that's a really great parable for what happens with the talich of the tzaddik. What happens with the process of the tzaddik is that the individual has the kind of the shift in consciousness that goes through them, and they go through the hero, which could take their entire lifetime. But that is fundamentally, setting the course of all of consciousness, and the world exists for the tzaddik, right? That's what there's all these there's these midrashim, and in Hasidism it's why does the world exist for the tzaddik? What does that mean? Well, it means that the tzaddik yisod olam, right? The tzaddik is the foundation of the world. Righteous man is the foundation of the world. That is Jungian and Neumannian statement in its entirety, which is that, the individual goes through the hero story, and then that has profound implications for the universal consciousness. Yeah.
The idea of the tzaddik as the axios mundi, the central pillar of reality. A term used by Eliade.
Yeah, that's a great word for it.
And borrowed by it was borrowed also by Professor Arthur Green in the way that he wrote about Rabbi Nachman, presenting him as well as this archetypal, this center pole of reality. I was thinking while you were talking about Jung's process, it's really interesting because there are a lot of really genius creatives, artists, performers, musicians, painters, poets, who will throw themselves into their own madness, into their shadow, to use the Jungian term. And from there, they'll pull back the most creative, the most devastating, the most gripping, the most harrowing pieces of art and beauty and sound. But what sets Jung apart here, it seems, is that Jung was not just an artist or a painter or a songwriter who was able to just let his madness go free and just let his creative passions run loose, but he is trying to be a scholar and an academic and a scientist. So he's entering into the madness and trying to bring back not just a rapture, a cacophony, a rainbow of color and sound and music and display, but he's trying to bring back evidence and data and material to understand the psyche and to help patients and to help people in therapy. And that's incredible. You think about these
incredible.
Who recently played the Joker? Who was
I don't know his name. I don't know his name.
But that guy throws himself into the madness head first. and he won like a.
Yeah, for Brokeback Mountain as well, right? What was his name? Not the most recent Joker, the one from the Batman movies.
But I'm saying all of these
I forget
characters.
his name.
I mean, and that's
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Oh
So
yeah, I mean the whole 27 Club, Jimi Hendrix. I mean,
right.
you
So
know,
I mean, so many of these characters.
all these kind of only could die young. Yeah.
Yeah. They push themselves over the edge, but to do that not just as an artist,
Yeah.
but to do that as a academician and as a scholar and as a therapist and as a
Right.
scientist.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then to think
Wow.
about to think about that as the Tzadik, as the righteous person in Hasidic folklore and practice, who does the same in some sense, who throws themselves into the Sitra Achra, into the netherworld, into the madness, and finds, as you say, and brings out an ethos, brings out morale, brings out hope, brings out courage, brings out the nitzotzim, to use a more metaphysical Lurianic language, to bring light out, literally to bring light from the darkness. I mean, and many retrospective studies of these characters see them as struggling with, deep depression and deep neurosis and deep
psychosis.
issues. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
And it also gives us a way to understand psychosis differently. I mean, we can stop talking about these things as negative labels, but instead, I mean, I've been very influenced by R.D. Laing, who says we got to stop talking about these things as breakdowns, but rather as breakthroughs, because I mean the psychosis of people living in a one-dimensional world that have no understanding, have no comprehension of even the ability to break through to other aspects of reality, seems equally, if not more, psychotic than people that have experienced, more than one aspect of reality. Wow. I'm curious. This is all.
I mean, I have a lot. Yeah. Go ahead. Ask me a question, because I could go in 100.
Yeah. I mean, we could go. We could go for hours.
Yeah, you opened up wonderful subjects right there. Russia team, which
I want to. Yeah, but I want to. I think there will be a lot of opportunity, God willing, to continue these conversations and to continue sharing them. And I also, you've been working privately on some projects which you're going to try and present as sort of video essays or talks to the camera in the right moment, and I'll keep pushing you to get that out of you.
Yeah.
But I want to take this opportunity. I want to take this opportunity to more drill into you and where this reaches you, so I can open you up as a personality to our audience and to the other contributing members there. So I want to ask.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Talk about myself. I'm good at that.
Yeah. So I want to. I want to ask this thinking, and maybe in the sort of Orabaric now it's Tchilatam B'Sofan fashion, to go back to where we started. We started very enigmatically and very cryptically. This way of thinking and this grappling between the historical and the symbolic, between the objective and the subjective, between the sane and the psychotic. Where does it? Where is it meeting you in your journey? How are you exploring those things? Take it away.
Yeah. I think I would like to use as a springboard, but we talked a little bit of what you said about Neumann is his ability to be a practician, despite the fact that he was able to induce these states of psychosis. And I think that is the model for the new, intellectual. I don't like, because, and I'm not going to use the word Uberman, right? But it's kind of like the new, thinking man is not just a thinking man, he's a feeling man, right? And the feeling man is one who's able to, it's a more complete person. Just because I've really been thinking about this lately, I'll just bring it to a Jewish point. There's
I'm guessing
in Bamidbar.
I'm guessing when you say man, you mean man and woman.
Man and woman, yes. Okay. Excuse my patriarchal terminology.
In Bamidbar, sorry, continue.
Yeah, not in Bamidbar. It's actually in Exodus. So in Exodus 4, at the end of the chapter, it says that, okay, Moses complains to God, says, I'm a man of heavy words. How can I bring this message to the people? And then he says, okay, I'll appoint Aaron, your brother. And then they meet on the Mount of Horeb, which is where the Torah is eventually given, and they kiss one another. And then they go to save the Jewish people. So, I mean, and Neumann, by the way, with, brings biblical criticism to a point where he said that there's these two strands in the Bible, which is the prophetic strand and the priestly strand, right? And the priestly strand is always kind of always sees itself, as being secondary to the prophetic strand, but sometimes tries to crush the libido of the prophetic strand. And they're always kind of warring it with one another, which is also what's happening within individual consciousness. But, the paradigm here, which is the brothers meeting on Horeb, where the Torah is given here, is that you have the priestly, right? You have Aaron, who carries out the kind of more, the revelation comes to Moses, who is the ear, right? He's the aspaklaria miria, the shining light glass, right? He's just a funnel, right? And then you have Aaron, who's the more priestly, who comes and takes that and puts that into ritual, so that the revelation can be enacted within reality, right? And that paradigm of the brothers kissing one another is very important, right? Because that's what brings the people out of Egypt. The ability for us, and on the individual level, what does that mean? It means that we have to be able to have the revelational aspect in the individual, but also to be able to have the priestly aspect. Right? One is not more important than the other. They're both fundamentally important, Shamayim and Aretz, right? And heavens and earth. And for me individually, I think that for somebody who has tendencies towards the more revelational, and I think that, if we're bringing it back to me, so, now how do I translate that into my life, right? 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 Whoever's thoughts are more than his actions, right? Whoever's wisdom is more than his actions, then he's just a tree that's going to get blown away, right? So we don't want that. That's not the paradigm man that we want. We don't want intellectuals sitting in their glass towers with overgrown cortexes, who have no connection to reality. And the ability to be able to connect it to reality is the ability to affect and to experience these states of psychosis, because that's the most real thing that there is. I mean, your psychosis and the psychological problems that you deal with, that is who you are, far more than your successes. I mean, on a statistical level, for sure. I mean, you are mainly 80%, I would say. I mean, I can't give an exact number for it, but we're mainly, we mainly grow and we're mainly dealing with our problems more than we're dealing with these successes. And to kind of hide within the, and I think that, in the religious world, it's kind of what's happened. It's happened in both the religious and secular world, right? The secular academic who is obsessed with post-structuralist theory is no less connected to, is no less in his theorizations and in his glass tower academic kind of philosophications, not connected to reality, no less than, somebody who grows up in a fundamentalist Hasidic world, who sees the whole entire world as, and all of history and all of life is kind of running through some eschatological spherical pattern where there's this obviously kind of, children who learn this, at age 11 or 10 or whatever else it is, how the spherical patterns work, and that there's this clear kind of way that reality is running, and then they kind of see reality. Both of them are equally disconnected from reality. And I think that the new man, the new man, that has such bad connotation to it.
Erich Neumann.
Erich Neumann, yeah, right. Erich Neumann, Amash. So, and I think that, and the way that I see it is that the feeling thinking person, right? The feeling thinking person is what we should be aiming for, and the feeling person is one who understands that all of this intellectualization is only perush, is only, and I think that the post-structuralists can critique, if not taking too far, can help us to see this, is
Perush,
that our narratives and perush, interpretation, thank you, that's the word, and the post-structuralists can help us see that, right? Because once I'm not obsessed with my own story and I can actually kind of question my own story and see if that's valid, it requires me to kind of look at reality, if done correctly, if the critique is done correctly with boundaries and a respect of subjective truth, it can help me to realize what's going on with my own life and to see reality, get out of your grand narrative, for hell's sake, before it brings destruction to the world, because I mean, that's what happened. That's what happened. And it can happen again, without a doubt, let's not be disillusioned. And so the feeling man is one who's deeply connected with reality. And the ability to connect yourself with reality is the ability to face your shadow, right? It's the ability to face the darker parts of you, right? And this is kind of like the Gnostic, the Gnostic desire to do away with the feminine material, right? because, which is just a stage, but they did that in order to escape the kind of the great mother, the pull of the great mother downwards. So anything that was identified with the female or with materialism was seen as bad, right? But that was just a necessary stage in order to have a development of consciousness. So we have to realize that that continues. Consciousness has another stage, and that stage is a return to the material. It's a return to the feeling, right? I mean that seems to me to be the end game, right? If there is an end, the end game of Jung and Neumann's hero story is the transformation. And so on an individual level, the ability to be in touch with my own life and to be a feeling person is more important. It is the first level. And without a basis, you just fall. You just build big towers and have big libraries and great, but that all just turns into ideology. But the feeling man, the man who's able to enter into his own psychosis and to affect actual change there by being in touch with the material, the feminine, his body, and I think, just one more little thing. And I think like a lot of literature kind of points at that. I mean, Nietzsche has this incredible, I think it's the 4th chapter in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I can actually check right here. I think it's on the tree on the mountainside, right? This is Kaufman's translation, which is wonderful because it's not too cryptic. And he says to this youth, he says, just like the tree grows its branches up into the light, so too do its roots dig earthward into the evil. And then the youth kind of cries out, yeah, into evil, which is kind of like Nietzsche's, being the harbinger of, this return to the evil, right? Which is not evil whatsoever. Yeah. And I think Whitman also did it around the same time as well. And if you kind of look at literature and we're kind of dealing, with the antithesis to that right now, which is kind of, and the danger, sorry, one last thing, and the danger of, of this stage of entering into the feminine again is, do you know how to interact with it properly? Or is the material going to have too strong of a hold on you again? And we see it happening. Right? We don't know how to interact with reality too well, right? To use very strong language, we kind of, I don't want to use that word, but we over shoev, like we've taken too much resources out of Mother Earth, right? And we're incredibly materialistic society, which is a good thing. It's okay. We need it. We need the balance. But the danger of that side is being swallowed up again. And, you need strong individuals who've gone through conscious, shifts and are, have had identification with the masculine, and women also who have had identification with the masculine in order to properly interact with the necessary stage, which, I think is incredibly healthy, which is the return to the feminine.
I feel like I'm missing a stage here. You mentioned initially that there were 4 stages. Initially, being in possession of the Great Mother, then the emergence of the father, the phallic emergence from the Great Mother, and I'm now hearing about a reintegration with the material, with the feminine, with the Great Mother, with
dragon.
So dragon is that's number 2. Is that where is that?
Yeah, dragon is number 3, if I'm not mistaken. I'll take it. Although it splits into subcategories: the Ouroboros, the Great Mother, right, which kind of slaying of the mother, the slaying of the father, which is kind of, and there's the captive of the transformation, or the transformation, or Osiris. Captive treasure. So there's slaying of the mother, slaying of the father, which, what do you want to ask?
Is there talk of the hero being killed by the dragon, of actually dying?
There's lots of myths where it happens,
right?
Or the hero gets blinded. The hero is blinded. It happens often,
right?
Which is kind of this the Gorgon, right? The Gorgon myth, where you get turned to stone if you look into the eyes, which is kind of, I don't really know what that symbolizes, but yeah, there's failure. I mean, there's they're kind of the warning myths that sit at the foundation of our societies, which is what's very interesting, by the way, kind of in a Jewish sense, is that besides the snake, there's a snake here. The snake shows up here and there, but we don't fight dragons in the Bible, right? All of the fault of the, and it happens in Christian literature, right? You have St. George in Byzantine, you have St. George, right? Who's slaying this dragon, which I guess probably in mythical Jewish literature, I'm sure shows up all the time, which is kind of the primordial snake, right? But in the literature of the Bible and our most foundational myths, besides the Genesis story, most of the interactions of our heroes are very human. Everything happens on the very human level, which is really fascinating. Really fascinating. I mean, I started to think about that, and I need to think about it more, but it's very, very interesting that Jacob and Esau, they're the foils for one another. And Jacob kind of fighting this angel, right? There's these psychological foils. I mean, Neumann wrote a whole book about that, about the brothers. I haven't read it. I should. But that, that we find, in the Jewish kind of sense, the Jewish ethic, I think that this is, this is kind of where my head is going, but I haven't really looked enough over there, is that our transformation comes through reality, right? We don't need to run to these over mythical spheres. We're very based in reality. It's through our everyday actions that, interactions, that our character develops, right? It's very grounded in reality, very grounded in reality. The Bible, or the stories that happens there. It's not that, for all this talk that, which is true, that the Bible in a certain sense mimics ancient Near East stories. In a certain sense, there's a whole chidush here. There's this renewal, right? There's this big, how would you say chidush in English?
There's a novelty.
Yeah, novelty. Very good. Yeah, there's this great novelty in that we're not Marduk or we're not Gilgamesh going, and fighting Humbaba in the forest, which is kind of, it's rather, it's our, and David, right? David has these interesting, or he fights, he gets into this conflict with Nabal, right? Who's this treacherous man. And there's a whole entire, transformation thing that happens there, but it only happens on the individual level. It happens between humans. Very interesting. I don't really know what to make of it yet, but
right. It happens on an individual and kind of on a
anthropocentric,
and also on a sort of a hyper terrestrial level. There's sort of like a geocentricity, not in the astrological sense, but in the sense that things happen in this plane on this world. At least in the biblical, at least in the biblical context, it's much later until we get real talk of afterlife and other worlds and places. The Bible happens right here.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Neumann actually has in the history of Jewish consciousness, or the origins of Jewish consciousness, the first part, Neumann has this line where it says Nietzsche was correct in his, as usual, he says Nietzsche was correct in the fact that, I haven't read that much Nietzsche, but just through Neumann, that, that there was this later, idealization and Christianization ethic of the Bible. And it's interesting because, and that really, you're right, it's the struggle of the individual and his flaws, that make the characters so deep inside of the Bible.
Yes.
Its ability to come in touch with the shadow. And kind of, there's this later kind of, and what's interesting about the New Testament or the Christian Bible is that Jesus never makes any mistakes. He's perfect, right? It's strange, right? I mean, again, we're talking about a totally different aeon.
Yeah,
right?
very
God's not talking with people anymore.
Right, very antithetical to a lot of the Hebrew Bible.
Very antithetical to a lot of what's going on beforehand.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like this almost this ratzon, this will that we have, this kind of perfect character to look up to.
Right.
But God creates the world out of chaos, right? That's the most fundamental level. And I think that the kind of the moralization, that's what Neumann said, moralization, the later Christian moralization of the Bible is what Nietzsche had picked up on. And that's true because, if and we're dealing with that, it brings it back to what we were talking about before, right? It's dealing with the into evil, what the youth says
Right.
in Thus Spoke
Right.
Zarathustra.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That we need to touch, we need to go down into the shadow side.
Right.
And that's what all the characters in the Bible do.
Right. As opposed to both
opposed to this
branches
kind of,
and both roots going heavenward.
right, exactly.
It's funny. It's funny because
right, exactly.
Nietzsche was very much not a fan of Christianity and the Christian ethic of the West, but Nietzsche's relationship with his anti-Semitism is one which has been written about and will be continued to explore for in seminars and lectures to come. But Nietzsche, in his anti-Semitic side, let's say, blames.
The thing is, it's okay to be anti-Semitic. That's like, I mean, as Jews, like, we're super, like, second anybody says anything anti-Semitic, we'll just do away with him completely. It's okay. Like, say it.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche's case.
It's
is
okay to be
complicated.
anti-Semitic.
I think interesting statement. I think Nietzsche's case is more complicated because of because of the Nazism, which emerges later and is quite infatuated with Nietzsche.
Right.
But Nietzsche goes ahead and he blames the state of morality of the West on Christianity, and then he blames Judaism for giving the Western world Christianity. So it's even the thing
which isn't untrue. Which isn't.
No, it's not.
I mean, it seems. It's not untrue, but it's not that. But the thing is that Judaism was, if you look, this is something I'm starting to look into a little bit, just because of the course that I'm taking to deal a lot with Christianity. But what is the fundamental theological, split between Judaism and Christianity? Because Christianity was just for Jews in the beginning. I mean, it's something that happens later with Paul, right? Paul of Tarsus, who makes it kind of makes it a proselytizing religion. And the too soon thing, that we just talked about before, which is kind of, let's not get into that.
Yeah.
Save for another conversation.
I definitely sense that we could go on until the morning here. But I think that will suffice to introduce you to the others and introduce you to the people out there, and the audience will want to hear more, and we're going to have follow-ups, continuations. I want to end with two things. What was the first of the two that I wanted to do? I can't remember. But it'll come back to me. The second of the two is I want you to share with whoever's listening to the end, which means that they very much enjoyed, to share where they can find your stuff. Are you posting your stuff anywhere online? Do you have a blog? Do you have a podcast? Do you have Instagram? Do you have something? Nothing.
As of now, I really don't have anything.
Okay.
Nothing. I mean, I was thinking of starting a little blog with my with like these thoughts, but nothing as
that will
of
change.
now.
I know that you're 1 second, but you.
But I have an email. Hey, wait! I have an email. An email is a great thing. Right?
Please share the email.
And so my email. Yeah, my email is Shimmy SHIMMY WEINBACH @gmail.com.
Cool.
And I carry out email correspondences with people. So
awesome.
It's a really great. I mean, especially I think that I really like it when people write me emails if anybody's interested.
Yeah, I think that's very generous.
I deactivated my Facebook, so I'm not on Facebook right now.
Cool. I'll pop your email address in the description as well. And I do remember now what the first point of contact was. But you have shared me some of your writings in the past, and I feel like they were on some sort of WordPress or Tumblr or Blogspot.
Yeah. So there is the abandonedkeepa.wordpress.com. But I haven't posted in there in a while. I kind of went through this strange, like a little bit of a visionary stage, but it was all based inside of my head, and it wasn't very holistic. And the stuff that I wrote out of there is like kind of interested, but I'm a little bit embarrassed about it.
Okay. The first question which I wanted to ask you, which I remember now, is I wanted to know what projects you're up to now. What do you have any ongoing projects? Do you have anything you're involved with? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, really right now, I would say I'm kind of looking a little bit deeper into the prophetic versus versus the priestly strand throughout history, and kind of how that dualism kind of repeats itself all the time within the Jewish people and also within the world, and trying to bring those two together and show that they need to work together, and it has, and to show that it's happening, within our society as well, that there are the visionaries and there's the more practical people, and that we need to work together. That is a great vision of mine. And in addition to that, I mean, I'm trying to pass this tour guide course, which is
Nice.
a big project of mine, which is not disconnected whatsoever, because the eventual dream is to bring people to Israel and have them go through, to kind of do transformational seminars based in the land of Israel, and through, the Jewish ethic, and to learn, and do more interfaith kind of stuff. I really want, if there's any Muslim listeners out there, especially, I really, really want to delve deeper, because I know a bit about Christianity. I think I've kind of understood it, very, very basically and elementary, like the Christian myth and kind of the ethic there. But what very much so excites me is that I think that the current Israeli, our being out, the state that we are in right now with the Arab nations and with the Muslim world is important, and it's there for a reason. And I think that the collaboration with our Muslim brothers, can create something very exciting. And kind of trying to draw back, go back and into the sources and understand the similarities between our cultures, and bring about a golden age of, Hebrew Muslim golden age is something that I think about often. And I wouldn't say it's a project of mine because I haven't taken any practical acts toward it, but, this is kind of just me putting out my words into the air and hoping that something kind of happens on that level.
Nice.
That's kind of the things I'm dreaming about right now.
Nice. Very cool. You'll be happy to hear that you've probably been following to some degree.
Yeah, I saw you do some incredibly interesting videos on the on the Sufi videos.
So I've been engaging sort of with Sufi thought and history, but the really exciting part of that is that I've had a tremendous amount of audience engagement and interaction, very serious interaction from Muslims.
On those videos specifically.
Yeah, on those videos specifically, because they were dealing with Islamic thought and history, from Muslims from across the world, really appreciating, wanting to know where they can find out more and read and engage and question and correct me and teach me, and that's something which I was hoping for and something which has been forthcoming, which is really, really cool. And I'm hoping to see where that goes.
I mean, that's amazing work on your part, and I really hope, and I mean, I want to again put out a prayer kind of here, which is that I think that Judaism is kind of a balance between the two, and it sits in between the Western world and the Eastern world. But I do feel that that there's a great necessity right now, especially within the Jewish world, to understand our more Proto-Arabic and Middle Eastern roots, and the theology that comes along with that, and the word really, and the hearing of the word of Islam, which is incredibly prevalent, I think, from the little that I know about it, is something that is incredibly profound. And I really do hope that the project continues, and that, we get to have a collaboration with our Muslim brothers
and sisters,
and to understand on a deeper level what's going on, and to bring peace. That's what we want to do.
Yes, with God's help. Shimmy, any last words?
Yes.
To the seekers out there.
Yeah, sure. There's, I guess, what I would like to say is that the fight is inwards, and the Messiah is inwards within all of us, and that may we continue, the fight inwards, and I think that will have, the effect, and we turn inwards, then I think that will provide the healing that we're looking for. So let's go.
Nice. Thank you so much.
Yes.
What a
Of
pleasure.
course,
What a
brother.
pleasure, Shim.
Thank
What a
you.
pleasure to get
What a
together.
pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
Yes,
Yes,
Excerpt to
brother.
Shim.
Okay, we'll speak soon.
Love you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
A huge thank you to Shimmy for giving us his time, for sharing his brain and passion with us. Please do subscribe because I'm going to be showcasing some more of my brilliant, talented friends. And I'm going also to get them to start making some of their own content, hopefully, and to share their ideas directly with the channel in their own form of content. So, yeah, if you are down for this project, subscribe, keep liking, keep sharing, and reach out to me. I would like to interview you as well. You. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. And I'd like to pick your brain. Because if you're here, you're my type of person. So, what are you waiting for? Hit me up. Oh, and keep seeking.
Hey, 1 second.
Yeah. Scans like these in the night, a life, visions of oasis, making you think twice.